Steve, do you have an external camera plugged in?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would just remove the USB and put it back in.
Oh, I turned it off and on. It seems to be okay now.
Always the solution.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay, so welcome back from the break, everybody. Thanks to Meghan for moderating the previous session, and to all of our partners and panelists. I thought it was just such a great way to get things started this morning. So thank you so much for your words and for your time. All of the work within Mobilizing Justice takes place within our 6 working groups. And over the past 6 weeks or so, we asked all of our working groups to convene an annual meeting, a little workshop, one working group at a time, where the leads and the participants and interested partners got together to review what each working group accomplished over since the beginning of the project last year, and revise and update and share the plans for the upcoming year. So I know that a lot of you attended those individual working group meetings, and each one was an hour to 2 hours long. The goal for this session now is to have some kind of lightning presentations that summarize the year in review and what's coming up next year for each working group, to give everyone a chance to catch up on all the activities across the project, especially areas that you yourself haven't been so involved in personally. The way we're going to do that is through a series of lightning presentations and then Q&A from the audience for each working group. So, roughly speaking, 10 minutes for a presentation and 10 minutes for Q&A. I'll moderate the session and try to keep us to time, but if you're going over the time, I'll just have to jump in, and there's no better way except for me to jump in and ask you to wrap up. For folks in the audience, please, as much as possible, type your questions in as they come up, type them into the chat so that we have something to turn back to at the end of each session. We don't have a ton of time for discussion after each presentation, so getting as many of your thoughts and queries and things into the chat as possible is really great, so that we can have time to kind of answer things behind the scenes if we run out of time for doing it in the discussion together. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce Professor Jonathan Hall, who is our academic lead of Activity Group 3, the Pilots and Experiments Working Group. Jonathan, would you like to take it away?
Yeah, so thanks for organizing this and having this chance to summarize what we've been doing. So can I get the next slide? So this is activity 3, and if you're like, wait, why are we sharing with 3? I have to teach, so they let me go early. But we're doing innovative pilots and policies. So what's the goal? The goal is to evaluate 8 or more new transportation technologies or policies for their equity impacts and potential. So I kind of think of this as where the rubber hits the road for MJ. They're like, we do a lot of great work on understanding these problems and measuring them. And this is about where can we test some ideas and things that might really make a difference. All right, next slide, please. So what does it mean to be an MJ pilot? So one, we want to evaluate something new. That could be new infrastructure, it could be a new technology, it could be a new policy. And we want that justice aspect, an equity lens on it. And we want this to be really rigorous, like highest quality of work that lets us really identify a causal impact. So the ideal situation is where we say, hey, here's some policy we want to roll out. We design an experiment to test it, and then we see what happens after. Next slide. So what have we done so far? In year 1, there was a lot of groundwork to be done. So we developed guidelines for is a valid pilot. We developed an application procedure and guidelines, and then we went through this whole process of proposals. So we started with 12 proposals submitted, and we worked through some matchmaking and some open comment periods to let everyone have feedback on that. And one thing I want to highlight is just in going through that process, some pilots were moving forward and then they fell apart. And that's just reality that I'm sure many of you have experienced this in your own fields, right? That's like not everything reaches fruition. And I just want to highlight, like, we don't think of that as failure. We think of that as just part of the process. And where we currently are is that we have 1 pilot that's been funded. There are 5 that are still kind of working through the application stage and getting everything lined up. So what are the ones underway? Just briefly, we have a pilot going in Edmonton and Toronto. We're going to evaluate the impacts of new light rail being built. And so that's the only one of these that's like fully launched and funded. Then the other 4, there's a Fair Fares pilot in Toronto, something around the idea of universal basic mobility happening in Vancouver. And 2 at the very early stages are looking at e-bike subsidies or e-bike shares, and 1 in Montreal and 1 in British Columbia. So, and I just want to highlight a few things that were changing. Before we had done this, what we did in year 1 was, all right, here's the application procedure, and we're going to work through this once a year. And one thing we learned is that, that once a year schedule just doesn't seem to work great. And so we want to keep this easy, a low cost process that helps people form teams. So what we're changing to is a quarterly cycle. And so the way you submit your idea, you just email me, and then we'll convene the group once a quarter to get feedback on pilots and try to build that team, which I think is a lot of the value of mobilizing justice, so that we have this community. And so we can build the best possible pilots. And so our plans for this year is to hopefully get another 3 to 6 pilots started. And one thing I want to remind all of you of is that we have region and mode quotas. That is, we want to make sure we're covering a diverse kind of set of pilots. And so, yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, so yeah, thanks for the kind of introduction to what I would call the pilot program for mobilizing justice. And a lot of work went into kind of setting up the parameters and definitions and the processes over the past year. And we're making good progress towards seeing some projects getting launched now. I think I could correct one little piece of information that we have a second pilot that's launched. We'll be evaluating the low income pass for transit users in the city of Toronto as it gets rolled out to different population groups on the rollout schedule for that program. I'm not seeing any questions yet typed into the chat, but if anyone has questions about the Mobilizing Justice pilot program or any of the pilots that are already on the way, please feel free to chime in. Yeah, so this is I'm seeing a couple of questions come in. Brendan is asking about the financial aspects of the pilots. The details are, I think, fairly straightforward, but Mobilizing Justice has the ability to partner on pilots with other entities, in that we can fund and support the costs of data collection, data analysis, experimental design, research and writing. So we enter the equation as the kind of research staff part of a pilot, but then we're looking to our partners to kind of fund the actual operation of the pilot itself. So we have 2 years of RA support for each pilot, and about $10,000 cash to support the operations for say data collection. And actually, I just realized that I'm not supposed to be answering these questions. It's supposed to be Jonathan. So Jonathan, do you want to pick up on anything that you're seeing in the chat here?
Yeah, there was one I thought was, so first, Jeremy, thanks for the suggestion. We can look at that. Riley asked, how do you determine the success of a pilot? And one thing I want to highlight with that is, the only failure would be a pilot we don't learn from, right? So yes, ideally, the pilots we discover something that really helps. But if we find out something doesn't work, that was a success. We now know one thing not to do again in the future.
But in terms of common threads throughout the pilots, there seem to be some things emerging, like an emphasis on whether or not the intervention is kind of removing constraints and barriers to people's daily mobility, whether or not the removal of those constraints is facilitating social inclusion as measured by, say, participation in daily activities. Or we could have pilots that look at more targeted outcomes. For example, the impact of mobility credits on allowing people to get to job interviews or securing better employment. So we could have more general or more specific, but it's, yeah, across the board, the emphasis seems to be on the degree to which it removes barriers to better participation and inclusion. Given that we have, so Brendan has a question, Jonathan. The impacts of different types of pilots may take different amounts of time to materialize. So how do you determine when to measure the equity impacts?
I think it's a great question, and that's, no, we don't have a one-size-fits-all kind of structure. Our hope is that things can show up within a year. But I think so far, everything I've seen, the longest they've gone out measuring is a year. If there was a case to meet for longer, we'd be open for that.
Yeah, so maybe Matt Palm has been leading. Can I put you on the spot, Matt? Because you've been leading kind of the pilot on the LRT project, which is, I guess, moving along at the fastest rate so far, and wondering if you can speak a bit more about what that process has been.
It's been fun. What about the process? Like,
so, what's the team? How did we build the team? Who have you been consulting with? Where are we at with data collection and so on?
Sure. So in late spring, it was evident that the city of Edmonton is going to be opening an LRT line at the end of the summer. And we thought, even though LRT isn't necessarily a brand new technology, this is an exciting opportunity to get some good before and after data on a very common technology that the government has put a lot of money in, and whether or not it addresses people's transportation problems, as well as whether it increases activity participation. So I reached out to a couple of professors on the MJ network, and on our website, we have all the faculty affiliated with our network listed. And I just thought about who might potentially be interested in working in that. I just reached out to them. Professor Ahmed El-Ganaidi at McGill actually is doing an evaluation of the REM already. I don't think it's equity focused, but it was transit satisfaction focused. So I reached out to him. And then we have a colleague, Nick Klein at Cornell, who's a member of our partnership. And I reached out to him and pulled that team together. And so now we're doing a study that looks at both the impact of LRT on transit satisfaction from an equity lens, as well as as well as from an activity participation lens. And then we reached out to the cities, Edmonton, and then we realized, well, here in our backyard in Toronto, the Eglinton Crosstown is also opening. So we just emailed our colleagues at the city. And so we pieced together an evaluation of those two projects. And it was actually very stressful because the Edmonton line was supposed to open September 1, and then it was postponed by a year. So we have more time now. And we're currently in the process of testing an instrument that will measure transit satisfaction, suppress travel, and activity participation. So, you know, one of the things we're testing is asking people directly, like, what trips have you not been able to make recently because you didn't have good transportation? And we're going to see if the percentage of people who say they've foregone trips has gone down between the before and after period when the line opens. Does that help? Or
Yeah, absolutely. And I see Howaida has a hand up now.
Yeah, so I work for the city of Edmonton. I'm a director of urban growth and open space here. So I was really pleased to see this project being considered as one of the pilots. I guess one thing I'll just highlight is the terminus or the starting station, I suppose, of this new line is in an area called Millwoods in the city, which is actually home to quite a diverse population, lots of racialized folks. So I think that's also an interesting aspect to consider, yeah, just as part of this work. So I was happy to see this project be considered for a pilot.
Thanks, Howaida. And one thing I'll add is, you know, for MJ pilots, it's important for us to make sure that we're engaging with impacted communities before, during, and after, right, at every stage. And so the way that we made that happen is we just reached out to people in the network. We ended up connecting with some social service providers at Mount Dennis who are at the end of the Eglinton line. And we were able to have a workshop, and that was influential in the survey's development. So the survey actually covers many different aspects of safety and how that is going to change as a result of LRT coming in, which is also something we've heard as being important in Edmonton as well. So it was an exciting opportunity. And, you know, I would encourage you, if you're thinking about submitting a pilot proposal or in the process of developing one, to just reach out to members in our partnership to put a team together, because it's really a fun opportunity to get a bunch of folks in the room to really co-create in this process.
Good, thanks so much. Okay, so yeah, if there's any other kind of questions, or if this is spurred some ideas that you want to speak to us further about in terms of project development, that's really what we're doing behind the scenes in terms of the working group leadership and the central team with Matt, myself, and Jasmine is helping to facilitate that process. So please do reach out. And we're also going to be seeing next week, we're going to have a session on the pilots. And what we are doing is bringing together actually a whole lot of non-mobilizing justice pilots, mostly from the US and a couple from Canada, to come and present to us about their experiences in running kind of equity-oriented pilots of different types, so that we can kind of spur on our imaginations and creativity and thinking about what we want to do for our mobilizing justice pilots over the next couple of years. So thanks, Jonathan. And I'll next introduce Michael Widener and Jean-Francois Cantin, who are co-leading Theme 1 working group, which is called Prioritizing Populations.
All right. Thank you, Steve. And it's really a pleasure to be at the symposium to see everyone's work. And I'm happy to share a little bit of what we've been doing in Theme 1. the Prioritizing Populations group. So again, I'm Michael Widener. I'm an associate professor at the University of Toronto, and my co-chair, Jean-Francois, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
I'm Jean-Francois. I'm working for ARTM, Senior Advisor in Strategic Information.
All right, thank you. So if you could go to the next slide, we'll start off by telling you a little bit about what we've been doing. So I think at first it's important to note that the we in this theme is actually quite large. We've had a lot of individuals interact with our theme, and I want to make sure that they're all acknowledged. We've had a number of authors and contributors. The list is there. I won't read through all of them, but we really couldn't have done the work that we've done so far without you, and it's really set us up well to do the next portion of our project. So we've completed or are about to complete two different reports, and I'll go over those individually in a minute. The COVID-19 Transportation Equity Report and a report on how transportation equity has been measured in the gray literature and the academic literature. In addition, various members of the Theme 1 group have consulted with Activity 1 or around the national survey. That isn't necessarily a Theme 1 central item, but a number of our contributors have been in conversation with Activity 1 around the national survey. We also have a few next steps that I'd like to go over, but I'll discuss those later on. If you could go to the next slide. So our first deliverable was a review of the implications of COVID-19 for the delivery of equitable transportation, and with a focus really on Canada. And so I've put a link in the chat here that would direct you to this report. But the idea with this report was that we wanted to review how the pandemic affected people and their use and benefits from different modes of transportation and transportation systems, and understanding ultimately how all this impacted transportation equity. The review was led by Dr. Palm, and so I'm happy to let him chime in at any moment if he's interested, but essentially we reviewed over 170 articles and showed that policymakers implemented service and infrastructure changes pretty quickly, unevenly, and without considering equity in most cases. Because of this, we see a lot of communities that benefited from pandemic-era transportation changes, while others experienced more challenges. So we saw a real uneven distribution in the impacts of transit changes, transportation mode changes during the pandemic. We do list 8 different takeaways in the document, which are in the link that I've provided, but a few of those are outlined here, including essentially having more of a toolkit ready and available when disasters strike for planners, having improved data and equity measures beforehand so that when shocks to the system occur, we're prepared to understand how people are being affected. Thinking about government interventions and funding support in a longer term way so that we know we can afford to actually subsidize transit in particular as systems recover. And I see this last item here, which I think might have been added after, is that public transit should be planned as more than a commute mode, and active travel networks should be considered as an everywhere to everywhere solution. So these were some of the big findings from that initial report. And I'll leave you to the link if you'd like to learn more about that. If you could go to the next slide. Thank you. Oh, yes, thank you. So the second report, which is nearing completion and we expect to be releasing soon, was a review of measuring transportation equity across the gray and academic literature. We had a number of amazing RAs help us scan thousands of studies and narrow down that big body of work down to 183 papers. We're still extracting how the studies measure transportation equity, but we're focusing on things like understanding suppressed travel, excess travel, barriers to travel, and activity participation, as well as satisfaction with the actual travel that is undertaken. We do plan on putting forward recommendations that will be intended to advise practitioners and researchers on how measurement of transportation poverty and equity can be done. And this, we hope, will relate to some of the future surveys that perhaps will be produced by Mobilizing Justice and others. If you could go to the next slide. Now, those are the things we've completed. What's on our schedule for the next year is a new transportation-related equity measure that will be implemented, or calculated and implemented across the entirety of Canada. And this atlas that we plan on producing is modeled after the CanMarge index, which I've put a link to in the chat. This project is essentially developing this data set that will combine sources of information from Stats Canada, some accessibility measures that are being created by other working groups in Mobilizing Justice, to create this index that shows the levels and the magnitude of transportation-related equity issues across our country at the DA level, is what we expect. Professor Beaujolais at Polytechnique in Montreal is leading this initiative along with their RA, Maria Laura, and they've just started this work. And I hope that we'll have more to present to you in the next symposium in 2023. Finally, after this is done, we'll be soliciting the group here to conduct a number of case studies. And these will be sort of in combination with some of the work being done by Activity 2, I believe. I forget the numbers here, but this is Meghan Winter's group. I forget which hers is. But we'll be identifying case studies that allow us to dig into some of the specifics. Essentially, we're looking for nuance, and we want to be able to add color to some of the experiences that are happening across the country when it comes to transportation-related social exclusion and equity issues. So the idea is that we're doing these big national level indices, but then we want to dig in and have people examine particular cases in specific locations, ideally with a nice representation of geographies across Canada. So not just Toronto, not just Vancouver or Montreal, but also perhaps case studies in the prairies or Atlantic Canada or the territories. Now, be on the lookout for a call. These are sort of open CFPs for people related to MJ, and we hope to hear your ideas, and we would love to discuss with you further about this if you're potentially interested. So be on the lookout for case studies in the near future. Next slide. So that's it from us. We're happy to take any questions, and I appreciate your time.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, before I jump in, I'll just give a moment for anyone to raise a hand or type a question into the chat about any of the work completed, or even better, a discussion about the plans for the national index, or questions about case studies going forward. So, Michael, I'm thinking about.
There's a couple of questions that just popped in the chat, Steve. Would you like me to? Yeah.
Yeah. Why don't you...
Okay. Parameters for the index. So the CanMarge index, excuse me, is constructed. They took an approach where they created sort of 4 important dimensions. I don't remember exactly what they are. Like, I think it's housing, maybe marginalized populations or something like that, and economic resiliency. And within each of those categories, they have a number of variables that they incorporate. And so each dimension then consists of multiple variables that are weighted in a particular way to sort of represent marginalization in the case of the CanMarge index. In our case, I think the approach, it's to be determined what are the parameters. But I think we're going to take a similar approach where we're going to try to identify the high level things we know impact transportation related social exclusion and inequities, and then identify what variables we can access at a national level across Canada, and include them. And then we'll need to work with the community, with experts across MJ to determine how the weighting occurs. I think that's what you're asking, but if not, please feel free to clarify in the chat. And I'll answer Beth's question here too, which is how will the call for participants and case studies be shared? We'll go through the MJ communication channels. So the listserv, the website, social media channels, and we'll be sure to share this with plenty of time for folks to put together a potential proposal. The proposal won't be very burdensome. I expect it'll be actually quite short. And we hope that you would engage with us beforehand when we put the call out and maybe, talk to us about your idea. Jean-Francois and I will be sort of trying to assemble a bit of a panel to select the top cases. But we'll want to make sure that, like I said before, that we're covering a range of different topics and geographies when we do that. But we'll make sure that there's plenty of time before the call is there. CIMD. I'm not familiar, Bill, with the Canadian Index of Multiple Deprivations. I actually don't know that one, so I apologize. I can look it up and see. I mean, this might be, I don't know if Genevieve is on the call or not, but this is all sort of happening now. So I'm going to just put a note about that particular index on my sheet here. And I think we're open to, learning from past indices that folks have used to represent data across the country. So if that's an example of one, we'll try to take lessons from it. So thank you, Bill.
I'll jump in for a second here and kind of just reflect on some of the talks that we saw this morning. And I know it was more than just Matt Davis's, but Matt presented some maps that tried to show the overlap between kind of equity deserving populations and levels of transportation supply, whether it's I think the case that he showed was cycling facilities. But, one of the things that we'll be able to do with this national index is intersect marginalization with the national measures of access to destinations for different modes of transportation and kind of define a typology of neighborhoods across the country who have residents that are both belonging to specific types of equity deserving groups, but also with specific combinations of existing ability to reach meaningful activity destinations using different modes of transportation. So, some of the research that comes out of that is, trying to classify and look for commonalities in the types of deprivations that different communities are facing, and see, which cities are, where's the how much are those different typologies occurring in different cities and why or why not? So lots of interesting things to do there. I have a question for the audience around, how do you think your organization or your research program or your community might kind of want to use a national data set that helps explain and describe where different communities are kind of more or less disadvantaged, or suffering from inequalities in the transportation system? So I'm seeing, yeah, Sherwood, would you want to speak to that a little bit?
Sure. I think I can give something brief. I think we have lots of I think similar to a lot of the other municipalities, lots of projects that we're undertaking, if not progressing quite as far as we want to. And the opportunity to validate the progress we're making and ensure that we're reaching conclusions that seem to be consistent with what other data sets are showing, because we're often working from different data sets, or we're trying to project into our 30-year plans and policies. That's going to be really important for us, especially when it comes to taking this type of work to council and being able to say that we are confident that we're seeing lessons and applications in our municipality that are consistent with lessons throughout the country.
Yeah, thanks, Sherwood. And I guess in a similar vein, I see a lot of the larger municipalities being staffed and resourced enough in order to generate their own kind of city-specific indices, like the one that we're creating for the country. But I guess I kind of see, in terms of use by partners, especially like the smaller cities or medium-sized cities that aren't generating their own indices or would rather pull something off the shelf, right, than try to create something themselves, as one benefit. And another is that comparability between regions. So how important is it to know that, or to communicate that, that the results that you're measuring are really kind of comparable to goals and impacts, being made in other regions? I'm thinking about, communicating to decision makers and whether or not they're more sensitive or more likely to respond to evidence that puts their city's performance in comparison with others in the country. Okay, so we have a couple of minutes. Jean-Francois or Michael, did you want to have any closing thoughts before we move on to the next working group?
No, only that I'll just add, feel free to reach out to either of us regarding either the index or the case studies. And if you have questions about the two reports that have been produced, also feel free to reach out. We're happy to either answer the questions ourselves or direct you to the right person.
Okay.
Nothing more to add. Thank you, Steven.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. So the next working group who's going to present is Activity 1, the National Survey Working Group, and that's being led by Catherine Morency at Polytechnique Montreal and Howaida Hassan at the City of Edmonton.
Thanks, everyone. My name is Howaida Hassan. I'm a director at the City of Edmonton Urban Growth and Open Space, and I have the pleasure of working with Catherine Morency on this work. I'll start off and then I'll pass it on to Catherine. Next slide. So first, we'll start by providing you with an overview of the Activity Working Group mandate, which is to design and administer quite a unique survey to understand the transport poverty and transport-related social exclusion in Canada. So this is really the first survey of its type in Canada, and we'll use the capability framework for understanding transportation barriers and suppressed demand, and the sufficientarianism framework to explore what combination of transport provisions might be considered a necessary baseline as we go forward with work. So through engagement on the survey objectives, we've identified 5 key areas of interest that the survey is going to investigate. So barriers and constraints, well-being and outcomes, satisfaction and gaps, suppressed and excess travel, as well as aspirations. Next slide. So the activities in the first year of the project created that foundation to identify these key areas of focus that I just discussed through the interesting engagement with Canadians and working with the mobility sector from across the country. Next slide. So the first engagement took place in November 2021, where we had 65 participants from across the country who primarily work in the social service sectors, mobility advocacy, and academia. We invited them to come and discuss those major themes of the national survey that we should see. So at the workshop, participants rotated between 5 breakout rooms on different themes to brainstorm and then discuss answers to different questions on things like aspirations related to mobility, suppressed travel, types of barriers and constraints that the survey should explore, as well as the types of questions that we should ask about social, economic, and well-being outcomes. So most commonly raised issues that participants felt the survey should explore pertain to safety, followed by access to destinations, public transit, and then access to or well-being outcomes related to social, cultural, and religious activities. And in addition, our working group was also able to identify the key data needs and interests of the stakeholders and project partners who would make use of the survey results, which is ultimately, we want to be able to have this information be usable across the country and for the work of other streams of work within the Mobilizing Justice stream. And so ultimately, we were able to glean a few key recommendations for the working group to consider as we develop the national survey. Next slide. Prior to our first engagement meeting with the Community Equity Advisory Table on the national survey, the working group asked the committee members, apologies. So a key activity of the working group was actually to participate in the first year in supporting the formation of a Community Equity Advisory Table, or what we call the seat, and then engaging the seat on the survey components. So myself as the co-chair on the national survey, I've helped with that group, and I was pleased to work on a task force with other MJ chairs to recruit members for the seat. And so prior to our first engagement with the seat on the national survey, the working group asked the committee members to provide their feedback through a pre-meeting survey. So the intent of that survey was to understand the key elements that the survey design team should consider. And this included the importance of certain survey questions, particularly regarding 4 categories with respect to home location, access to destinations, access to mobility services, and infrastructure and mode choice. And so the survey also evaluated the accessibility of language of certain questions and tested survey design elements such as the length and so on. The working group then convened a virtual meeting with the committee to review the results and took a deeper dive into some of the elements to elaborate on those. Next slide. Finally, in year 1, we were also pleased to collaborate with Statistics Canada to include a limited number of questions in the Canadian Housing Survey. So the survey offers the working group a unique opportunity to ask a set of questions related to car ownership, mobility access, transportation mode, and if included in the results, we could then provide the working group with another source of data against which to compare the national survey results as well. So I'll turn it over to Catherine now to discuss our year 2 activities.
Okay, so thank you. So so currently what we're working on is 3 main tasks. So may I move to the next slide, please. So the first thing we're working on, actually, I think we're almost working only on this. Well, Hediye is my student who's attending today. So we're trying to develop the pilot survey because before moving to the real national survey, we actually need to test a lot of things. So we're working on the design component. Of course, it involves proposing questionnaires, and I put an S because it will be multiple tests we will do, not only one questionnaire. We need to test various scenarios. We need to implement the survey on the web. We will do the pilot, see what we can measure using the available data, and then do report and move on with the final design of the national survey, the first wave at least. And we plan to have the interactions with the seat to report on what we're trying to implement as the pilot survey. So actually this is a weird slide. Okay, so the colors have changed, but usually I have colors. So the first part, which should be blue, so it's all the descriptive and factual elements. So all the 4 main first boxes It's about things that we will ask everyone, and it's about description of your context. So where you live, your dwelling unit, household members, age, gender, blah, 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 driving license. So things that are usually easy to describe and that will help us make some classification control for when we do models or we want to make analysis, we need these basic elements. And then at the end, so the last part is about measuring burden. So we want to make sure we gather information to improve our survey tool. So it's about the complexity, how people felt the survey was in terms of design, the perceived duration, what we should have asked and we didn't. So all these elements to assess the quality of the tool. And then in the middle, that's what we're working on, because we have we're quite used to doing these descriptive survey. We do this in travel surveys, like describing what people do, but then in the middle, the perception, aspiration, barriers, mismatch, all these concepts, this is where we're working on scenarios. So what will happen is that we'll have a common part, and then it will be split. At first, we think 3 scenarios where we will test ways to question the respondent, and we're currently identifying the main anchors, and the anchors are home location, your neighborhood, your trip to your main destinations. And we're trying to use these anchors to make a wide list of all the elements we're interested in. So what affects the quality of transportation services? Does it prevent you to do things? So, and then we're going to formulate some questions. And of course, since we have the burden of doing the survey, we will not be able to put everything in. So we will need to make choices. So that's why we want to test scenarios and see among these scenarios, what are the questions that maybe are getting the best answers in terms of information gathering. And this is when we will hopefully be able to design the last one. So this design of the survey, we're currently working on this perception aspiration component, because this is the most critical one for this new survey. Next slide, please. And we are doing this right now. So we have some dates which are critical. Namely, we need to go to the ethical committee. So this means that we need the design ready in like 2 weeks to go to the ethical committee beginning of October, so we can launch the survey and make it implemented on the web. So we will get feedback to the seat with the scenarios we create. We will need to, after this pilot, test whether it fits to the data needs of the other groups from MJ, and we will finalize the recommendation for the real national survey. So next slide. So there's another component we're doing. So my student Hedier is working as part of her master on the concept of web burden survey. So the burden of web surveys. So it's how do we make sure that the way we design the survey doesn't increase the burden and that we get good quality data. So she's currently working on a paper, because next year will be WCTR, so World Conference on Transportation Research in Montreal. And there's a deadline fastly approaching. And we're trying to get new insight into how can we a priori, so before launching a survey, get an idea of the level of burden and make sure that we will not administer a survey that will reach high dropout rates. And of course, this is also to make sure that the next survey will be well designed. And next slide is probably about the main thing we need to do. So when we go to the pilot and then we assess the result, then we need to also answer some questions for the national survey. So of course, finalize the questionnaire, or maybe multiple questionnaire. This is something we could choose as well. We need to finalize the survey tool, confirm which are the target groups, what recruitment strategies we will do, and we can both combine controlled and uncontrolled sample, as long as we can monitor where the answer comes from. Need to go to the ethical process, and hopefully next year we launch the first wave of the national survey with maybe the opportunity to have multiple waves. That's something that will need to be confirmed. And I guess that's it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Excess travel. Yes, so there are many concepts in these. So when we try, so I think the best concept is about mismatch. So it's when you're trying to see what is the gap between what someone does and what someone wants to do or wish he could do. So when you have excess travel, it's when you travel more than you would like to do. So maybe your distance is longer than you wish it was, and you have the suppressed travel. So it's all over the place in the sense that you could travel more than you wish, less than you wish. You can have more car than you wish, less car than you wish. So it's all about not being on spot with your, I can say, your aspirations or your ideal situation. So there are various ways to ask questions. It's either about asking people their barriers. Yeah, so I'm sorry, I was reading the chat. So it's about barriers. It's about dissatisfaction. It's about, impacts on well-being, missed opportunities. So these are all concepts. It's a fuzzy cloud of concepts that are all about understanding how the transportation situation that can come from where you live, because there are many reasons why you have to travel the way you do. So how does this impact globally the quality of life at the end, and how is it spread across the population, and how does it impact vulnerable groups? Am I answering the question? Yeah, dissonance. Yes, right. Mm-hmm. Oh, big silence. So of course I can say that when it's going to be time to test the pilot, we may need some help to test the tool and the questionnaires.
So I have a question for some of the audience members here. We have funding to conduct the survey, and we have funding to support, a certain sample size. But that, like, the financial constraints may mean that we're not hitting, a large sample in any one given municipality. The bigger cities will have more samples than the smaller cities because we'll try to keep it representative and things like that. But I'm wondering about opportunities to raise funding to collect data in jurisdictions where there's strong local support for beefing up the sample locally. So thinking about where you live, whether or not you work for a municipality or a community organization or an NGO, or would you think it's likely that we would be able to raise support to increase sampling in your jurisdiction?
I don't see an answer, but I see another question. So let's see if an answer comes in, or maybe we try to answer the question, and then we get the answer from our question. So Brendan, hello. So actually the idea is, so we are hoping to get a representative sample of the target groups, but of course it will have to come at the price of larger zonal system, in the sense that we will not be representative at the DA level. So we are moving up the spatial aggregation level to try to be. So this is why we're hoping to use a panel with specific variables to control for those that we will target. But we also aim to recruit respondents using any other way, in the sense that the idea is to have more observation, but depending on the analysis you want to do, you may want to use only the subset that was controlled in terms of features and spatial location. So we will have quotas to reach for the main CMAs of Canada and specific target groups. But the question is really about when the survey tool is ready, we can have more respondent, and then we can either increase the sample for some areas or launch it openly and see what comes in terms of respondent. But we need to make sure that we can differentiate it. But that's something that we see more using multi-frame sampling. So we use multiple ways to recruit people. So we have a wider sample, but we actually need to correct it afterward when we try to wait. So I don't see the answer to your question, Steve.
Okay, well, consider it a thought planted in your heads for now, and then we'll take it
Can
from
I
there.
expand on your question just to see if it gets it an answer? Maybe the question is more like, not are you interested, but what would it take? What would you need? Or like at what stage in the process? Because maybe the question I don't have an answer to is like for cities to pitch this, to say, could we have $5,000 or $10,000 or $30,000? What do they need? Do they need the draft survey? Do they need a one-page like project plan? Just that, I don't know if that's helpful. Or maybe Catherine and Howaida know the answers to this. Maybe Howaida knows.
Well, I guess that having the pilot result will help to see what kind of information can be made available. And actually the funding is not about developing the survey. It's not even about administrating the survey. It's about recruitment. What is costly? When the survey tool is ready, when you have the questionnaire, the cost is about getting people to answer. So it's reaching the target population. So we can reach other population because we can decide that we move to low income population to start with, because that's what we first proposed. But if there are other target populations, as long as we're able to reach them and use the same survey, that's possible. If we need assistance, because a web survey is a self-administered. Yes, self-administered survey. So maybe you have target group that won't be able to do the survey. So maybe we need students with iPad that go meet people. This is more costly. So the question is about if we want additional sample, would it be interesting? And if someone is interested, then what's the procedure to get there?
I like your suggestion, Sherwood, about understanding the difference between this and typical, because it is different from like a household travel survey that we might usually complete. Like with this survey, we're really trying to understand those gaps that Catherine spoke to earlier, that deficit of transportation and mobility options, availability, the mismatch between their desire. So we typically don't even delve into those kind of questions in household travel surveys. We really are just looking for a revealed preference, like what they actually did, as opposed to this survey. We might be wanting to ask about what would you have rather done, or what could you have done, or what missed opportunities did you have. So yeah, that's a good suggestion to make that difference clear. I'm also wondering, like at the municipal level, I know one of the things that we have at our disposal here at cities is like our communications abilities, be able to reach sort of into communities and through our social media or other platforms to let them know about things that are happening. But I wonder if that generally reaches the general population, but is it reaching sort of those the equity deserving groups that we're looking to tap into?
So the question on how it differs could be more documented, but in this survey, you will not have a trip diary. What did you do yesterday? That's not the purpose. We need basic information on probably the main destinations, the mode typically used, so we can target some questions afterwards on the perception of these modes, but it will not allow us to actually describe travel behavior. But that we already have this information. It's really about the latent demand probably, or what we are not observing when we just ask people what they did. There's a hand raised.
Yeah, a hand from Megan.
Thanks. So can I ask, this survey, I probably know the answer, but just for here, this survey, will it quantify the percent of the population experiencing transport poverty? Or does that come from like pre-existing sort of MJ work that might have mapped such things? And this survey will quantify the experiences of people and sort of the opportunities, adaptations of people experiencing transport poverty. I guess I'm wondering that cities might be interested in knowing the proportion of people experiencing transport poverty within their city if we're providing that, but maybe other places in MJ can provide that. But what this survey will do will speak about the experiences of people experiencing transport poverty within those cities. So like, and sort of what gaps and interventions or like changes that might suggest.
Okay, so the way we will design the sample will actually determine what we can measure. So at first, if we target only low-income population, we won't be able to make inference to the overall population. So there was hope to be able to have a control group where we actually target everyone and we're able to compare what the low-income population provide versus the rest of the population. But with the current funding, the target is really about low-income population. So that's a question because if we cut the sample, then we won't have enough for the entire Canada with the current available money. And it's really about recruitment is the problem. It's the cost of recruitment. So I would say that we will not be able to say for every CMA the share of the population who faces transport poverty because we're not targeting the entire population. We're targeting the low-income population. So among the low-income population, we will.
Yeah,
that's a goal.
So I think I need to move on to the next working group.
Yeah.
But I think something to keep in mind is one of the main powerful things coming out of the survey will be linking it to those accessibility measures and being able to determine the degree to which our investments in transport result in outcomes experienced by low-income individuals across the country. So whether those outcomes, so it won't be longitudinal, but cross-sectionally in areas that are better served, do the low-income populations tend to report less suppressed travel, less excess travel, higher satisfaction with the transportation situation, and so on. And then that could, so it's really a tool that allows us to investigate the relationships between transportation supply and the experiences of in this case, low-income populations, but ideally even, a broader cross-section of folks who belong to different equity-deserving communities. So I need to switch gears now, and we are going over to activity 2, which is Antonio Paez from McMaster University and Michael Hain from the City of Toronto, data-driven equity standards.
Okay, thank you, Steve, and thank you to all my colleagues. Sound is okay, Steve? Okay, perfect, thank you. So Jasmine, I imagine that you have control on the slides. So keep in mind this picture of someone waiting for the bus in the snow. Does she love to do that, or does she have no other alternative than to wait there? Next slide. So this activity, our task, so I think of it in two ways. We have our research tasks, and then we also have these other tasks that are sort of the meta objectives of the project. So in terms of the research that we are tasked with conducting, we need to generate empirically validated equity standards for transportation provision. And the meta objectives, so as important, we are working to train excellent transportation scholars, researchers, and future practitioners, and to communicate successfully with our partners. So let me begin by telling you a little bit about the last point with respect to training. Next slide. So in terms of what has been achieved, we have started with the training process, and these are the students who are currently engaged in activity 2. So Anastasia Sukov, who started in September 2021, Magdis Mogadasi, who started nominally in September 2021, but actually only arrived in Canada in January 2022. Both working at McMaster University, mainly under my supervision, although as you will see, there is a number of people who are involved in their training and who are working with them. And then more recently, starting in September 2022, João Pedro Parga, who is supervised by Chris Higgins at the University of Toronto Scarborough. So we are tasked with providing standards for evaluating equity for transport provision. And so this has a number of different components. So by talking about data-driven standards, data-driven means that they must come from observations in the real world. And this means that we need to have data or use data when developing standards that tell us about how transportation systems serve people, and they can serve people really well, or just okay, or poorly, or not at all. So the second point has to do with what Catherine and Howaida mentioned earlier, this idea of a mismatch or a dissonance, which is, can people realize their preferences regarding mobility? Do they have that ability to do things in the way that they ideally would like to? Or are they forced by circumstances into making choices that are probably not the ideal? There is this mismatch between what they would like to do and what they can actually do. So think about that person waiting for the bus. So this is kind of the science part of what Activity 2 is doing, where we use data, where we have this positivistic approach, we observe the world, we see how people behave, we try to understand what's that mismatch between what they do and what they would rather do, if that exists. But then there is also sort of the philosophical side of things, which is that the standards must consider societal values. What do we think as a society are acceptable costs and desirable outcomes? And that is not science. That is not science at all. That is what we value, right? So it has to do with what we as a society value. And therefore, it really brings us into philosophical grounds that influence policy. Next slide. So a summary of what has been achieved in the first year in terms of the trainees. So our accomplishments, recruiting people. This is not as easy as it sounds. And we have been fortunate to recruit highly motivated, smart, hardworking students for this activity. As many of you will know from your own school days, if you went to grad school as well, so there is all the academic work of trainees. They have to take courses, they have to learn methods, they have to get grades that allow them to continue in grad school and so on. So that has been one of the accomplishments. Anastasia and Magdis are mostly beyond that that stage. They have completed most of their coursework. They both have comprehensive examinations coming up in the next few months. So that is part of their academic work and requirements to work towards their PhD degrees. And also they have all been working on the research assignments at the same time. Joao will be doing most of his academic work in the coming year, also facing a comprehensive examination probably before the end of 2023, and also is looking to his research assignments. Next slide. So in terms of research, so that's talking about the one of these tasks that we have, training highly qualified personnel. Some of the work that we're doing with them has to do with the research. And in this respect, we have started researching what are those societal values? What are the standards? How do societies value equity? And so we are working on a report on equity and justice conceptualizations. What are the dimensions and standards for transportation planning in cities? So this is a scoping review. It has been quite a massive undertaking. So I think that Michael Widener mentioned that they had looked at 160 documents maybe. Here in this project, we're looking at over 600 documents, and that's only looking at the academic literature. We have not yet looked into the literature. So it's been quite a large undertaking. The participants in this report are Anastasia, Ignacio, Magdis, Matthew Palm, Steven Farber, myself, and we have had help from a group of undergraduate research assistants who have been essential to screen the documents and begin getting all the materials that we need for their extraction. So there is a review protocol that's being created, and as you can see, there is a timeline that by our best estimate, the report should be ready before the end of the year. But data screening or screening of documents was still ongoing. Then there is their extraction, their analysis, and finally the writing of those results. Next slide. We are also researching methods. This is something that had a summer 2021 start because Anastasia was already at McMaster, and so we could get a head start with that. There is a preprint that introduces a singly constrained measure of competitive accessibility. Anastasia has led this effort with myself, Chris Higgins, and a friend of the project, Muaddaz Mohamed at McMaster. So this work by Anastasia drives a new measure of accessibility with competition that importantly preserves the number of opportunities, which is essential, we think, for equity analysis. So that's partly why we are so interested in what Metrolinx and others are doing with their accessibility measures. And we'll be connecting with them to learn about that work and see how that compares to this methodological proposal that we're putting forward. So there is a preprint. The link is there. It has more than 100 views and almost 50 downloads since it was first posted there just that would be 2 or 3 weeks ago. And at the moment, the document is being reviewed by +1. So it's undergoing peer review, and they requested revisions, which we hope to complete in the next week or so. So what's coming up in terms of this for year 2 empirical applications? So again, we will be looking to our partners for potential applications. And we do have some ideas already for how to use this in the study of accessibility to opportunities in Canada and potentially other countries. Next slide. So we are also researching data. This was a summer 2021 start, initially with Meghan Winters and Geneva Baristo, who was working with Meghan in the summer. This is active travel-based accessibility, and it's a review of data sources and needs from a Canadian perspective. What we would like to achieve with this is a good understanding of what data are there and what data would we like to have. So what is there that we can use that could be used almost off the shelf in a fairly standardized way? What can be used only in some places, say in Hamilton or in Toronto or in Vancouver or in Edmonton, but not in other places? What sort of things will we recommend our partners to collect in a uniform way so that analysis can be standardized?
Antonio, yeah, I just wanted to give you a heads up about timing. So we're at 2:15. There's only about 5 minutes left for the working group. So
okay, fantastic.
So
let me just
let
me just finish with this. So we're looking forward to doing consultation with partners to gain local knowledge. It's a live project. The repository is there. Next slide. And then just to finalize, I think the work on developing a better understanding on the behavior, which was the other component. And so this is going to be a catalog of impedance functions that MACDIS is preparing. So also coming up, complete the research, write a report and disseminate for use and publication. And then the last item is communication, and that is the work in the next slide that João will be starting with Chris, and that will be starting in the fall or the winter of the coming years. So I think that with this, I can wrap up my quick report and open up the floor for discussion, questions, comments, and suggestions.
Thanks, Antonio. I'll let people filter in with their questions, but I'm wondering about your plans to, I really like the way you set up the, the big picture goals of the committee around the standards that we set being based on observations, and wondering about kind of how you intend to study what levels of accessibility lead to different outcomes in this in society to help us recommend standards or certain levels of supply that to achieve certain outcomes.
Thank you. Yes, no, so that I think is something that will probably be coming up in the third year of the project. So once that we have, validated and have, received approval for the kind of methods that we would like to use, then the next step will be to see how they potentially connect to outcomes. So at this moment, it's only travel and maybe reaching opportunities and so on and so forth, but that doesn't say anything about what does it mean to have so much accessibility. Does that increases the chances of having a job? Does that increase the chances of making appointments with your doctor and so on? So absolutely, that is something that is important because we may base those standards on also empirical observations of the outcomes, saying, well, we can live with a 95% employment rate or a 90% employment rate or whatever, but that's something that I think comes in year 3.
Thanks. And Michael Hain, is there anything that you wanted to add as the co-lead?
No, I think Antonio covered it well.
Okay, and so just next week, you'll be presenting in your session some, is it preliminary findings from the literature review, as well as a more in-depth look at some of the tools that we've been working on to measure accessibility kind of outcomes associated with project investments.
And Steve, so if you would like to mention the work with Infrastructure Canada just very quickly, that I didn't mention at all, but that it's related, so it's up to you.
Oh yeah, well, we heard from them in this morning's panel, but yeah, another kind of research activity taking place within this working group is our collaboration on the development of those national accessibility scores that Shurav and Nick presented this morning from INFC and StatsCan. Okay, great. So thanks very much, Antonio. And moving along to our second last working group presentation, we have Meghan Winters from Simon Fraser University and Nancy Smith-Lee from the Center for Active Transportation. They are coming from Theme 2 working group on the transportation modes.
Thanks, Matt. So my name is Nancy Smith-Lee. I'm a senior advisor with the Center for Active Transportation, or TCAT, at Clean Air Partnership, and I'm the community co-lead of this theme. I'm going to be speaking to a couple of the slides specific to the work that TCAT's been assisting the theme on, And Meghan Winters, the theme co-lead, is going to speak to the rest of the slides. So I'm going to turn it over to Meghan now.
Thanks, Nancy. You can go to our next slide, please. Great. So I want to say that the theme too, our focus is on transportation modes, and it's much bigger than Nancy and I. So there's a whole host of students, research assistants, and faculty who have informed our work, and as well as community partners as we've gone about it. I think our theme, and you'll see our activities are really cross-cutting across the project versus a standalone work package associated with just our group. I see our role as sort of being a voice of or paying attention to different modes of transportation, walking, biking, transit. And then we've also heard the importance of keeping on our radar things and in our conversations, things like ride hailing and micromobility or different forms of travel as they come on. And understanding how people experiencing transport poverty make choices about the travel modes they use to meet their daily needs. Next slide, please. So I said we touch on with, and we work with a lot of groups. We sort of broke down our activities into 4 of our own sub-objectives that we sort of frame our work around. I'll speak to each of them. Really, this first year, we've been very heavily focused on Objective 1 and Objective 4. So I've got highlights just for you there. The first one is really to understand the experiences of different people experiencing transport-related social exclusion across different modes. So the choices they make, the adaptations they make. The second objective is to look at mode-specific geographic accessibility measures. And so that is partnered up with Antonio, who just spoke, and he's already covered it. The first presentation today spoke about the pilots and policy pilots, and so we've been involved in a lot of those conversations as we've gone forward. And then our fourth objective is to develop and implement an outreach and engagement strategy for involving local and national organizations. So Mobilizing Justice has an abundance of partners in sort of local, regional, provincial, national governments, and some partners in consulting organizations and a few within community organizations, but perhaps not as many, perhaps we don't have the breadth of community organizations or partnerships with community organizations working around specific modes of travel. So we'll speak to that. Next slide, please. So just a couple highlights from that Objective 1. So this is understanding the experiences of people and how they use different modes. So a couple of outputs we've had, just in case there's people on this call who haven't sort of been alerted to them or know where to navigate for them on the Mobilizing Justice website. So we did help out with Michael Widener, Matt Palm and team, who was looking at conducting the review of the implications of COVID-19 for equitable transportation, and we worked on the active transportation group. Without that, it was a really nice project to bring together different themes and activities across the project and sort of work together, even despite that we are a very virtual group at that time still. The second is just to highlight that we've done a few blogs. This is one example of a blog that we've written, and PhD student Kate Hosford wrote it. She should be on the call. Essentially, this responded to the fact that I felt like we were always looking for a statistic on, so, you know, the census data is a big data that gives us, or the common data source that gives us information on mode share and how people get to work, but that we didn't have an easy reference in Canada for like how that broke down according to different socio-demographic groups. So who are the people who are driving to work and how does that vary across geographic settings? And so we were able to just sort of dive into the publicly available data sets to do an analysis there and generate a series of graphs that we've used across multiple presentations and I hope would be valuable to others. I guess that sparked conversation amongst our group, who meets on a bi-weekly basis, about other gaps of data that we didn't have on hand. And one of the questions we were interested in is, what does the profile of the cycling population, or people using cycling, how does the profile of that, how has it changed over time from 1996 to 2016? So Carly McPherson was a PhD student who was associated with our group in the past year, and she did a deep dive into that kind of data set and has generated a manuscript that's been submitted to the Transportation Research Board, which we'll be happy to share more in coming weeks and months about the results from that. But it was really looking at digging deeper into like who's cycling in Canada, and again, it's using this like commute mode share, which is the publicly available data set. and looking at how that varied across sort of age, race, income levels, and other sociodemographic profiles. So those are some of the early outputs that we had in this past year, some of which were planned and some of which were unplanned, but responding to sort of needs of us or that our partners had seen raised. For Nancy, you can do the highlights for Objective 4.
Sure. So, so for this objective, TCAT's assisting the team specifically around community engagement and documenting the community response in Canada to issues related to transport poverty. So the focus of the first year has been to develop this engagement strategy that with the hope that we can create an effective two-way communication channel between community organizations and MJ researchers, but also to improve our understanding of the experience of Canadians facing transport poverty, specifically looking at that mode choice and how that impacts, how that intersects. So also in the first year, TCAT's conducted some really focused work on documenting the community response. So that's the output for that has been a catalog. We have two different versions of the catalog. In 2021, we had a graduate student, Sabat Ismail, who conducted the initial scan of 245 community initiatives in Canada and looking at compiling different data on different variables. And then there was an accompanying report that came with that, the Canadian Community Initiatives Addressing Transport Poverty. And so that kind of documents the process as well as providing some interesting examples of community initiatives. Then this past summer, Kara Martin joined our team as a graduate student intern and worked on expanding the catalog to 266 community initiatives, and also gathered some information on regions that were previously underrepresented and looked more at the needs of equity deserving groups and how that's being addressed. So we released just earlier this month an updated catalog and report, and those are all available on the MJ website. You can put a link to those in the chat. And so the catalog is searchable. You can see like a screenshot of it there. And so we hope that that will be a useful resource for researchers and partners. So also earlier this year, TCAT reached out to all of the 266 initiatives in the catalog to invite them to participate in a community of practice workshops that are going to be starting this fall, and looking for input into how to structure those workshops in the most impactful way. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that community of practice in a couple slides from now.
And so I want to just say that the catalog, I posted the report here, but we think the catalog's a great resource for all sorts of projects, people within MJ and beyond MJ. If you're trying to figure out sort of who's active in a community organization that might be active in your region, or someone to focus on or reach out to. It is sort of, MJ's talked about how we need to have a coordinated approach in reaching out to these groups. And so I would touch base with, I would say, Matt, Steve, or Nancy on that as we go forward. But I think it's been really helpful for me to just be reminded or sort of navigate through when I'm doing different projects. Okay, so what we hope to accomplish in year 2. So under our sort of Objective 1 work, we're working towards a policy brief, and this is something that was asked for early in MJ from our partners in this group who wanted to know about the barriers facing different groups. And Kara, we're sort of very active in the space right now on some kind of short partner-oriented output from this. That sparked this conversation about case studies, and Michael Widener and team have already introduced the idea of case studies and their sort of call for proposals and consideration of it. We're going to start moving with a few examples of that within our Theme 2 group right now, especially around places where we have student-focused student interests and capacity. And so right now we may look at sort of case studies that look at specific populations like older adults, people living in carless households in the suburb, or looking at race and cycling. But there was a number of other groups that have come up in our conversations, and I hope they get picked up across case studies. So we'll be working together with Theme 1 as we pursue that kind of work. And then, so we'll still be involved in activities related to objectives 2 and 3, sort of on a call ad hoc basis anytime we're needed. And then Nancy, you can go ahead with theme 4, or objective 4. Next slide.
Great. So as I mentioned, we're at TCAT getting this community of practice going to kind of better understand the current on the ground priorities and gaps, strategies, different initiatives taking place to address transport equity. And so earlier this year, TCAT reached out to to the organizations in the catalog and did some interviews and surveys to try to find out what would be the best approach and what people were most interested in. We definitely learned there's an appetite for this kind of conversation between academics and community organizations, but also with each other. Community organizations often feel kind of isolated in the work that they're doing and want to hear about common challenges people are facing and the solutions that are being implemented. Also looking for tactics for incorporating some of the equitable research best practice into the work that community organizations are doing. So based on the kind of feedback, these are the goals here on the slide that TCAT has set out for the community of practice workshops. So I just want to say that if you're interested in hearing more, TCAT has a session in next week's day 2 of the symposium where we're kind of digging into some of what we found in the catalog and some of the examples of community organizations work. And also David, the TCAT director, will be talking about the results of the engagement to date and what the community of practice will look like.
Super. Thanks. So I just want to thank all the people who have provided input and engagement in our theme over the course of the last year. There's a lot of individuals on this call. If anyone else is interested in sort of engaging more deeply, we have a regular structured bi-weekly meeting and you'd be welcome to join. Just reach out to me anytime. I think that's the end of our presentation. Open to any insights.
Thank you, Nancy and Meghan, for the great work that you did this year, and also, Nancy, Meghan, and team for the great work that you all did, and also for your presentation. Waiting for some questions to filter in, but I wonder if you could speak to kind of a bit about the breadth of types of actions that you're seeing from the community that you found in the catalog. And I was so struck by there's something out there for every mode, for every population group, and in every part of this country. And I mean, what does it mean that that this exists, right? And are there always going to be community initiatives like that, no matter how well we're doing on the government side on providing services, or the fact that we found all of this, does it really indicate that there are really serious gaps and inequalities and justify the need to really take action?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this too, Steve. So it's thanks for that question. Because it's, from my previous work, it's been really specifically around active transportation specifically. So it's been interesting to be part of this work of really looking at much more broadly, but still looking at mode specific, but looking at all of the modes and what is the community response, and what are the community actions that are being taken across the country. And I really do think that it tells us a lot about gaps. And so, not too surprisingly, a lot of community organizing around cycling in particular. And I think that really speaks to the lack of appropriate infrastructure across the country for cycling. I mean, I think that's definitely improving for sure, but there's still a long way to go. So I think there's definitely a tie that between the amount of activity around a certain mode and a kind of gap. But that's not the entire picture, because I think there's also a lot of folks who don't have the time or the resources to get involved in community advocacy. And so I think that's why it's really important to be, just keeping a good, really being, making sure that we're actually looking at all of the, regionally, the different modes. Like there's a lot of modes that actually don't have any much community response at all. Does that really mean that there's not a need? So I think that's, I think it's kind of, I do think that there will probably always be some community action around that. I think it's helpful to kind of just target where there's, where there is need and where there is, something that needs attention. So I'm guessing that we're not going to completely solve all of our transportation issues, anytime soon. So I expect that there will be community response, community action for a long time to come, would be my guess.
I guess one to add to that, I have a team member who always says it's really hard to do advocacy for walking, so there's not as much mobilizing or like gathering around walking as for better or for worse in small groups, despite it being a mode that everybody's using. And Kate has a comment in the chat as well. I mean, I would underscore that some of these groups are representing their communities and have the best connections to their communities. And so even if even if governments have funding and supports, these programs may well be better offered by the communities on the ground who can connect them to multiple places. And so I think a collective feedback from groups like this is that there's not consistent ongoing funding and that they spend their time chasing pots of money instead of offering services, or at the cost of offering services that they can do very well. So those narratives may come out. Kit, I don't know if you want to speak to it, but those narratives will come out as you talk to these community organizations and providers, and I think will come up in the community of practice events that are ongoing.
Thanks. And I'm seeing a couple of other comments. I don't know, Kate or Ariana, do you want to chime in?
No, I'm okay. I think I said what I wanted to in the chat, just that I think there'll always be a need for community-based programs. It's just problematic when they're relied upon to provide essential services, like thinking in smaller town communities where there's no public transport, and people rely on these nonprofit solutions like volunteer driver programs, senior shuttles, but they're not given the appropriate support and funding to do so. So, but I think there can be a big benefit when there is a public solution, and then the nonprofit sector can kind of add to it or make it better.
Yeah, I think in the best case scenario, that some of the community action in response to like a quite clear gap could be proof of concept. I'm thinking about like many years ago was involved in a community bike share program here in Toronto, organized by the Community Bicycle Network. It was a very small kind of initiative. It was kind of well loved. I think it really did help to show that this is something that we needed to be, installing in a more major way in major cities, which we've now seen that kind of rollout of municipal bike share programs across the country. So I think that can be one way that community groups can get involved in these kind of, they shouldn't be saddled with these kind of large programming efforts forever, but I think it really does help to kind of get things kickstarted sometimes.
So we're at time, but I wanted to also just take note that I don't have the exact number, but several of the initiatives you found were specifically kind of coming out of Indigenous community initiatives for Indigenous groups, and I'm wondering, could you highlight any of the things that you saw being different in terms of the community initiatives stemming from Indigenous actions versus others that you're familiar with?
I guess there's the ones that I remember the most from the catalog were in Regina, kind of a car, car sharing service set up specifically for Indigenous women and girls. And so, really in response to like this not being safe there not being a safe way for Indigenous women and girls to get around. So that is like a particularly just such a I hadn't heard about that initiative before. I've since seen it be, it's getting some good attention. But yeah, so that's, I think some of those types of initiatives are quite different from, kind of more traditional, like cycling advocacy organization membership base. Like it's a very, very different kind of response to real specific needs.
Well, and responding to threats of violence and security are quite different to, convenience or just lack of, lack of travel options. So yeah, it's quite a different kettle of fish there. Okay, well, we're at 2:42, and that means we have time for our last working group, and I'd like to invite Orly Linovski from University of Manitoba and Isabel Cascante from United Way Greater Toronto to speak about equitable community planning and engagement, theme 3 of the project.
Great, thanks, Steve. So I'm Orly Linovski at the University of Manitoba in the Department of City Planning. And Isabel has joined as co-lead, so I thought we'd have a moment for Isabel to introduce herself and a bit of her background.
Yeah, thanks, Orly. I'm Isabel Cascante. I'm Director of Research, Public Policy and Evaluation with United Way Greater Toronto. We have several focus areas. Of course, our focus is really understanding kind of the causes of poverty, but more so with a solution orientation to our research. So connecting the research to policy priorities. We've identified kind of 4, I guess, priority impact domains, as we're calling them. And so housing, income security, the strong sector, and communities. And so like mobility and transportation isn't one of our priorities, but it kind of cross-cuts across everything. So I'll be working with Orly and the team in the years ahead.
Great. Thanks, Isabel. Thank you. So I'm going to give a brief overview of what our 5-year objectives were and then talk a little bit more about what's been happening in the theme. So one of the first projects that Jay Pitter has led and is wrapping up now was a documentation of community-based priorities and advocacy work. And she's wrapping that up, and we expect to have a launch event and the final report available shortly. The second major project, which was being led by Chris Higgins at the University of Toronto, was looking at the relationships between land use value and transportation investments. We're also working on a survey of elected officials and decision makers to sort of understand their priorities, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then thinking further on down the line, one of the last aspects that we're going to focus on is sort of a process mapping exercise that looks at how equity is integrated in transportation planning processes, and integrating the views of elected officials, policymakers, and practitioners to sort of understand where are the opportunities for intervention. Next slide, please. So Chris and Robert are here, so I'll talk briefly about the work they've been doing, but I'm sure they'd be happy to answer questions as well. They've been looking at the relationships between land use, value, and transportation investments. So they've begun on a Canada-wide accounting of how new transit projects have affected property values, aimed at understanding whether there might be changes or seeing changes in terms of affordability around new transit stations. So this is an example of their work that they've been doing. Here where the cubes are individual condo sales in downtown Toronto, stacked according to their floor height within the individual buildings. Next slide, please. And so one of the main aspects that I've been working on, along with Jennifer Dean at the University of Waterloo and two fantastic students, Abigail McLaren, a master's student at the University of Manitoba, and Samantha Leger, a PhD student at the University of Waterloo, is a survey of elected officials. And I think from the session this morning, there were a few comments about how to communicate ideas about transportation equity to decision makers. So really the survey is aimed at better understanding elected officials, their values, and actually their personal experiences with transportation. And sort of one of the overall objectives of that is sort of understanding, if we know more about elected officials, is there a way to translate our research about transportation equity in a more meaningful way, or a way that gets more traction. We've also had a lot of help from FCM and CUDA, both with the pre-testing of the survey and promoting the survey, as well as the rest of the working group that's been really involved in developing that survey. So it's gone out and it's actually closed. It was distributed to elected officials, mayor, councillors, reeves, etc., across Canada, both ward councillors and at large, depending on the community, as well as we included regional councils when they were responsible for transit. So the survey focused on four main blocks. First of all, what do elected officials see as transportation successes in their communities? What are their priorities? And we also asked them what they thought the priorities of the rest of council were, to try and understand if they felt that there were disconnects between them and the rest of the elected officials for their communities. The second block was about what do councillors know about transportation barriers in their communities or inequities. The hope is that we'll be able to tie this to the national survey, maybe have a bit of connection between what the results of that survey are finding in terms of barriers and what councillors might know about their communities. And we were also interested in their values related to equity. So we offered sort of two contrasting options, and we asked which aligned best with their personal values. So just one example from that, we asked if, one option would be public consultation is only fair if people from different identities and communities are able to fully participate. So that was one option. And then the other is if people choose not to participate in public consultation, that doesn't impact the fairness of the process. So we had a series of, I think, 7 of those options to sort of gauge what are values related to transportation equity. And then lastly, if you could go back to, thanks. We asked about the sources of knowledge. So what types of expertise and knowledge do they draw on to understand issues in their communities and that people might be facing? So understanding if they draw on professional expertise, if they try and go directly to constituents, if they use other sources like social media, and sort of what are the implications of that for professional planners and engineers. And then lastly, this was all sort of in the framework about specific demographics of elected officials. So we asked some questions about their travel, their usual mode of travel, whether they owned or leased a car, identity questions, whether they're a member of an equity deserving group, and I think really interestingly for us, whether they or someone important to them had personal experience with the transportation barrier. So that survey has just closed. If you don't mind going to the next slide. Thanks. So in terms of our year 2 plans, right now we're focusing on analysis and synthesis of the survey data. We're hoping to actually have preliminary results in the next few weeks, along with a 2 or 3 page policy brief to sort of summarize what we found from elected officials. We've had there was a lot of geographic diversity in the respondents. We've had respondents from Atlantic Canada to the territories, and a real range in terms of community size. So small, very small communities that might have, a weekly or twice weekly service provided, all the way up to major metropolitan areas. So we'll be doing analysis on that. The next stage of our work will be in-depth interviews with elected officials. So thinking about diving deeper in terms of understanding, giving more context to some of the survey findings. And then lastly, developing some of our knowledge mobilization materials and thinking about how to best translate these findings into something that's useful for practitioners and elected officials. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Orly, and Isabel as well for putting the presentation together and summarizing the work. Can I give Chris or Robert a minute also here just to present or speak a bit more about what they will be moving forward with in year 2 in terms of their property values assessments and kind of neighborhood change within transit corridors? Sorry to put you guys on the spot. Okay, so while we can wait for them to figure it, I see Chris is here, but I know that they're also working quite a lot on that problem. But before we move there, questions from the participants about this the survey data, the survey of elected officials?
So the survey was sent to over 2,000 elected officials. The criteria that we used was that they had to be in an area that had public transit, just so we had some comparability between them. And we got 165 responses from that.
So how do you think that we could use the results of the survey to kind of address that question that Maddie raised this morning around, making sure that decision makers have the equity concerns kind of well understood and front and center when making these big decisions? It seems like, the practitioners are there, the community is there, but still the decision makers, there's a big gap in agreement.
Yeah, I'm interested in seeing, again, we haven't done the synthesis or the analysis yet of the survey data, but I'm interested in seeing the values, right? I think there's an assumption sometimes that, maybe not an assumption, but I think the values vary significantly between officials, just based anecdotally on, email responses that we got, not even looking at the survey, but, comments that we got, there's a real range. And definitely something like this, we got responses from people that have been thinking about equity for a long time and very interested, as well as people that don't see the value in it necessarily. So I think understanding those two, or at least one of those extremes is really important, and how you create messages for that wide range of elected officials, I think is going to be a good question for us as we move forward.
And I'm wondering if there's a lot of folks on the call who, as part of their day-to-day work, are preparing reports and answering questions and making presentations to elected officials, and wondering kind of where they see the opportunity, where the opportunities lie in using a survey like this to help them with their jobs as well.
I see another question from Fergal about the backgrounds. So is that about like their professional backgrounds before they were elected?
Sorry, I'll speak up here. I meant kind of cultural backgrounds or any kind of socioeconomic or demographic characteristics that might be included as part of the surveys.
Yeah, so we asked whether they identified as part of an equity deserving group, and they had the option of selecting. So if they identified as racialized, as LGBTQ, as a person with a disability, I think we had 7 options for them. We didn't go into more depth than that. There has been a national survey of elected officials, of local officials, and not a lot of diversity, right? So we have some of that context background. So we asked about whether they're a member of an equity deserving group, how long they've been an elected official, and if they serve on any other transportation related committees, but that was the extent of it. I think maybe that's also something that we want to dive in a bit more deeper with the interviews. If there's something, were you thinking that there's some other area that we should cover?
No, I think that's perfect, just what you outlined there. Thank you.
I think Robert wanted to say a few comments about the work that he's doing with Chris.
Thanks, Robert.
Yep. Sorry, I wasn't expecting to speak, so I was really in an awkward position. All right. Yeah, so looking at the relationship between land use, land values, and then transportation investments, we are looking at specifically transit-induced gentrification. So currently, the literature is somewhat undecided. It's not really clear as to the role transit investment is facilitating gentrification. As people expect that, like that's the expectations of people or the understanding of people that automatically given transit investments, which has benefits such as improved transit accessibility and then transit-oriented development, that's with the land use, it generates some sort of demand. So when you look at an interplay of demand and supply, you realize that prices tend to go up. That's if you have a lot of people chasing limited or finite resources, in this case, the accessibility, and then the transit-oriented developments, which has several amenities that are desirable. So then given this, it can be traced, like it can impact land values, as I stated, which may influence residential mobility decisions in the sense that everyone wants, people desire improved accessibility. As well, they need, they might be desirable, they might want to live in transit area communities because of the TOD context, which offer several amenities like I've stated earlier. And in Waterloo, it's been documented that there is a latent demand for TOD communities. So then this, in a way, like I stated, if there is increased demand, property prices might increase, and this might influence neighborhood composition in terms of demographic characteristics, meaning current residents may have a very difficult time competing with an influx of capital that might also want to live within the catchment area. So then these are like hypotheses that are currently stated in literature, but then it's not yet been proven. So then through national accounting of land value uplifts and also looking at residential mobility like movements, trying to see where people are moving to, we hope to estimate the actual role of transit investments in facilitating neighborhood changes through residential displacement and gentrification.
Yeah, thanks. And we have a really unique opportunity with some of the data sets that we have at our disposal to do that kind of at a large scale for the first time in Canada. So looking forward to that piece of work for sure. So we're at 3 o'clock now, which brings us to the end of this monster 2-hour session. Thanks everyone for listening in. The main goal, as I said before, was to kind of catch everyone, get everyone up to speed on all the different activities that are taking place across the project. I know a lot of people are deeply involved in one or two areas and then have less knowledge about what's happening within the other working groups. So this was just an important exercise to go through to get everyone up to speed. We wanted to give people an opportunity to participate and give feedback. Like I said, each of the working groups had 1 to 2 hour long workshops within the last month, where we did a lot of intensive workshopping of all of the plans and results, and wanted to just give an opportunity for people who weren't at those workshops to chime in here as well. We saw a lot of surface level, like introductions to research projects, but more or less for the rest of the content for the symposium now is going to be deep dives into specific projects and really allow audience members to sink their teeth into more in-depth presentations. Starting at 3:30 today, we've got a session of graduate student thesis lightning talks. So it's pre-recorded videos of all of our incredible PhD students across the project. You've seen how they're involved in the different research projects, but for many of them, those research projects are a piece of a much larger dissertation project that's even bigger or extend beyond the scope of MJ. So we're going to learn about those dissertation projects this afternoon, and then come back next week on Wednesday, where we'll have deeper dives into the national survey, deeper dives into some of the literature reviews that we've been conducting. We're going to have a really exciting panel on successful kind of social equity pilots being conducted outside of the Mobilizing Justice Project, or previously completed pilots. We're going to have a panel on developing our community of practice, and then a final plenary session at the end of the day. And that's all happening next week on Wednesday. So we'll pause now for 30 minutes and see you back at 3:30 Eastern.